You have to remember, we began playing Bloodborne knowing nothing, not what it was about or where it was going or even its name's meaning. So that's how we have to read Bloodborne, with no insight from the start. Actually, before the start, back at the game's reveal that later became Bloodborne's menu cinematic.
Welcome to the world of Bloodborne.
This is the exact moment where From Software's director gets name dropped, that the name Bloodborne was assigned to a game that had been known as Project Beast and was assumed to be named Beast Souls, since all recent FromSoft games had souls in the title. It's safe to assume FromSoft intended not only to keep us uninformed, but to let our assumptions mislead us. So, instead of a title, we're greeted by a blood transfusion made sinister. Next, we see a massive, convoluted city, and as we pan a long way down from the city rooftops to claustrophobic cobblestone streets, we see nothing. A deserted street with everything the living deserted, and highlighted by light, an abandoned Victorian baby carriage, and a coffin chained shut. Following that, we see a backlit man in a wheelchair. Spooky enough, but mostly because such a frail, creaky man is made so intimidating. Then comes what we would assume are the game's enemies, men and half-rotten dogs, marching with torches and pitchforks. We're all but waiting for Frankenstein's monster to appear, but instead, we get this. And in the scene's conclusion, we find two things. The marching men were wolfmen, and they show more humanity in their fear than this executioner demonstrates in his slaughter. And as we later learned from the game's cover art, we play the executioner. Then, as a final tease, we watch this executioner traverse dark and spacious interiors until coming to candles, a headless angel pouring something onto a hairy, cracked animal skull, and as our executioner reaches for it all, a massive beast appears from the darkness and crushes him. Let's settle for calling out themes of worship and higher knowledge, and the danger of reaching for such things. But none of this really established Bloodborne as a video game, or why it needs to be one. So, believe it or not, a close reading of Bloodborne begins and ends with another video game. Metal Gear Solid 3. MGS3's story is one of the best and most mature in video games, despite certain design choices, and the gameplay is masterclass stealth and survival. But the stealth isn't what makes the story great. The game's climax, for instance, is a fist fight followed by cutscenes. The primary gameplay, stealth, didn't communicate the narrative. Contrast that with Passage, a 5-minute allegory for life. It uses gameplay to impart its message so well that within a matter of minutes and clicks, you understand what the creator wanted to say. But for Passage to simplify such a big subject, it had to be abstract, loose, more a generalized experience than a narrative. A player carrying the weight of their actions is one thing. A player understanding this weight entirely through their actions, without the developer taking the reins, is another. Even the most celebrated narrative games rely heavily on cutscenes. It's a rare feat to truly unify narrative and gameplay. And so, by this metric, Bloodborne is the best game ever made. Even more so than developer FromSoft's other series, Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, but we'll get to why later. Most game reviews focus on mechanics and lore separately, but the thesis of this series is that in Bloodborne, they are one and the same. And Bloodborne's central question with its unforgiving gameplay and world is this. In a world of conflicting factions and individuals, goals and morals, and no restraints, what is the cost or even definition of progress? Since discovery is so important to how the game unfolds, we'll only discuss things as the game reveals them. So let's start a fresh file. When you select New Game in Bloodborne, you're dropped cold into this.
Oh, yeah. Paleblood. Well, you've come to the right place. Yharnam is the home of blood ministration. You need only unravel its mystery. But where's an outsider like yourself to begin? Easy, with a bit of Yharnam blood of your own. But first, you'll need a contract.
From here, you create a character. The origins, which act as your starting classes, or how different strengths and weaknesses are divvied up, tell you about the world. This reinforces the fact that Bloodborne's narrative and gameplay are irrevocably linked. For instance, if you were the lone survivor of some horrid event, it stands to reason you'd have endured due to some natural resilience. Hence, lone survivors have high health, or in this game, vitality. All origins follow this kind of logic. Milquetoast lives result in even stats, but troubled childhoods give the scrappy survivors high endurance, which determines how many actions you can perform before exhausting yourself. Violent paths leave you focused on your strength. Professionalism hones your skill, and military veterans have balance across these first 4 stats. 2 origins focus on mysterious stats and hint at secrets of Bloodborne's world. Noble Scions sacrifice resilience for skill, and a stat called Blood Tinge, which is somehow related to Quicksilver bullets. In one menu item and description, we've connected blood, Quicksilver, bullets, and nobility tens of hours before the game offers more details. More inexplicably, a cruel fate means that you faced terrible hardships, but are now confident in your purpose. And this translates to a high arcane stat, which at this point is explained approximately 0. From this, about all we can gather is that seeing the worst of this world gives you arcane, hidden, maybe forbidden, knowledge and power. Lastly, and maybe the true tone setter, is that a blank slate origin with across-the-board low stats is called Waste of Skin, and comes with the description, "You are nothing. Talentless. You shouldn't have been born." This horrible indictment, however, takes on new meaning if you take a character with this origin to the endgame. We'll come back to this. There is some evidence later that Noble Scion fits your player character, or PC, best, and if we take liberties with our assumptions about which Hamlet the lone survivor hails from, this is the most interesting choice narratively. But in every other way, Milquetoast is the most honest avatar in a game that, from the very first cutscene, throws the player in the deep end with no explanation or preparation for what's to come. It's also technically the default, so let's go with that. And as a side note about defaults, we're modeling our player character after the one used in promotional material, for a number of reasons we'll get into later, but that means making our protagonist male and leaving most of the features at their defaults. And as all non-playable characters, or NPCs, refer to the PC as the Hunter, or Dear Hunter, we've named him Hunter.
Right on!
In any case, your choices here don't impact the story. And once you complete this most ominous of medical histories, you're presented with this.
Good. All signed and sealed. Now, let's begin the transfusion. Oh, don't you worry. Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
You found yourself a hunter.
And you wake up alone. The cold open of Bloodborne and the difficulty of the first area can make it brutally inaccessible, and much of its brilliant foreshadowing and synecdoche can't be appreciated when you first play through. But right away this feverish opening touches on far more than it may seem. To recap, the very first sentence you hear in the game is,
"Oh, yeah. Paleblood."
implying that both the speaker and the hunter know about Paleblood. It's further implied that Paleblood drove you to Yharnam, famous for its
blood ministration.
Word choice is incredibly important to this game. The definitions of ministration relate both to hospice care and religious service, as in a church minister. Blood is healing, blood is holy, and pale blood has to do with all this, but all we know right now is that your unexplained goal requires you to go into Yharnam and
unravel its mystery.
It's even further implied that your being an will make this harder, but that Yharnam blood can help you. Apparently Yharnam is pretty liberal about giving away blood.
What?
You need a contract to do this, almost like selling your soul, and after you've signed yourself off and
Sealed.
your fate, and lie back on an operating table, this old man plants the first seed of doubt about this reality.
Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
From here, you have what any sane person would assume is a fever dream. If you take this at face value, it can leave you completely lost. And that is a major weakness of this opening for newcomers. But what we concretely have is this. You came to Yharnam to learn about Paleblood, because Yharnam administers unique blood. You accept some of this blood into your body, and then you have this nightmare. Beasts are linked to the bodily, to blood, and to fire aversion. The little white things, almost like emaciated fetuses, appear after the beast, don't hurt you, and are connected to a serene-sounding woman, making them seem trustworthy, and you've been selected, or discovered, as
a hunter.
And you wake up in Yosefka's clinic. What you don't have is a past. The closest thing you have to a backstory, besides your chosen origin, comes from two sources. First is your clothes description in your inventory, or the foreign set, as the game calls it. They simply explain that you likely traveled in secret, perhaps either wanted for something specific, or else generally unwanted, and that you are now without memory. Perhaps from the blood transfusion or something the little white guys did. From your vest and chain, with slack shoulder straps, the most you can venture is that you are a capable, working to middle class person. I'm not alone in saying this design brings Tesla to mind, which, as it later turns out, is a comparison that holds water. The second possible source of backstory you have right now is a nearby handwritten scrawl, both its author and intended recipient of mystery, which reads, "Seek Paleblood to transcend the hunt." Okay, here we go. Did that blood minister leave it for you? Or perhaps you for yourself, knowing you'd lose your memory? But then, when did you lose your memory? Does the player character's memory start when the player comes in? Or was the note written for the minister, which would imply that you, a patient seeking your diagnosis with Paleblood, was what he was looking for? If that's the case, who could have written that note for him? Or was the note just there? With no other hints here, we're forced to ignore these questions and only consider the message's meaning, and this proves to be even trickier than it appears. Word choice is incredibly important to this game, and there are several instances where a more direct translation from Japanese gives us important information about the game for a close reading. VaatiVidya, whom I will reference several times throughout this reading, covered two of the things we've discussed so far in an incredible video about translation. First is that blood tinge could be more accurately translated as blood quality. This plays further into the noble bloodline interpretation, whereas blood tinge implies either how your blood is tinged by something else, or else how tinged you are by blood. Unfortunately, all three of these things could make sense, given what we discover later. And I hope you're getting used to statements like that, because they're going to come up a lot. More to the point, seek Paleblood to transcend the hunt is more directly translated as seek Paleblood to complete the hunt. As with blood tinge and blood quality, either transcend or complete ends up being viable. There's a hunt for something unspecified. You, for whatever reason, are chosen or discovered as a hunter. And this hunt will end, or the player will transcend it with Paleblood. Or perhaps the hunt will be ended or transcended simply with the act of seeking Paleblood. Maybe the hunt is a side effect of something else. Quick note, if this reading seems to be splitting hairs or grasping at straws, We're going this deep because some of what we're covering here isn't just the first time you'll hear about it, it's the last time. Sure, blood tinge in the hunt will be much further explored, but Paleblood is explicitly mentioned in-game 5 times, 2 of which you've already seen, and a third of which reveals nothing about the term. So we've already discovered half of everything we'll ever know about the game's most mysterious and maybe most important word. Furthermore, to unsatisfactorily resolve one of the biggest mysteries thus far, we don't ever learn more about the intro cinematic's Blood Minister. He's never even referenced again. Yosefka, we'll discover, is not this man. And that handwritten scrawl's origin, don't hold your breath for an answer. The narrative is sparse, but between those split hairs and buried with that grasped straw is one of the best stories ever told. Unfortunately, you're going to have to accept that some of the story's specifics are lost to Bloodborne's horrific collapsing world, and you may have to seek your own answers. In any case, curiosity and/or fear compel you and the hunter forward. The window reveals a striking dusk, an orange dying of the light, and you descend below it. You find 2 gray puddles on the ground, and the white things pop out with scrolls to explain the controls. You'll note both of these messages relate to combat, and suggest you should be armed. Scouring your inventory reveals that you are unarmed, so you practice some punches and progress further. If you have the online functionality on, you should discover a room filled with red puddles. Activating one shows you the death of another real player. So the third room of this game is filled with deaths. Fantastic. But why? You spy a beast feasting on something. Its back is to you and its health is less than half. Most players will resolve themselves, maybe even try to sneak up on it and attack, only to discover that your attack registers a 4 next to the health bar and no noticeable damage done to the beast. Considering the game has only taught you how to lock on and perform one attack, it's safe to assume you die here. And that's it. That's not it, of course, but consider this. That should have been it. Despite your strange history, your grand travels and desperate search, even your willingness to introduce foreign blood into your body, you arrive in a world you don't understand, abandoned by the Blood Minister, and profoundly alone. You don't even make it out of the hospital. Incidentally, this brings to mind Metal Gear Solid V, where the protagonist only escapes a hospital where mass murder is taking place because someone is helping him, whereas he watches scores of other patients as they're slaughtered. We stand on the shoulders of giants to survive. In Bloodborne's case, you're alone, and an injured beast sees you. Just a random animal as far as we know, and even in its weakened state, you never stood a chance against it. You're overpowered and violently slaughtered. An anonymous death in a strange city, a corpse that will be devoured before anyone knows you were ever there. At the cost of miraculous blood, Yharnam has become a nightmarish hellscape. At the cost of wanting more, you were slain. Your struggle was meaningless. Everything was. From that perspective, what we've seen of this world isn't just tragic, it's nihilistic. How does the average person survive in this place? Short answer, they don't. But you... You are a hunter.